want to jump in right off the bat is say, in your decades of experience in those areas, what observations have you had when talking with stakeholders, public officials, community leaders when it comes to the arts and creative sector?
I think primarily it is the fact that while there is an awareness of the arts in general, the impact it has on quality of life, etc., things of that nature for citizens, how people feel about the arts, but they don't seem to be able to make that translation then over into philanthropic support, either privately or definitely on the state level, as you would hope that might translate when they see the importance, in my career, in which I started in 1980 as a development assistant at the Columbus Symphony Orchestra. I was part of the very first development staff. Before the 30 years before that, it was all volunteers. It was the Columbus Symphony Orchestra Women's Association who did what was called the annual maintenance drive. And then in the early 80s, there was a move. We're going to professionalize this. We're actually going to, have a dedicated staff that does this. And I was very fortunate to be on the ground level of that. And at that time, the Columbus Symphony Orchestra was the single largest performing arts organization in the city. And at that point, its budget was $1.6 million. And a lot of the community leaders said, we want to be a major symphony orchestra by the end of this decade, which was the 1980s. And so Evan Whalen, who was the music director at that time, had been music director since 1956, was asked by Barbara Zuck, the longtime critic of the Columbus Dispatch, when will Columbus have a major symphony orchestra? And he said, Columbus will have a major symphony orchestra when Columbus is ready to pay what it takes to get one. And he was... Yes.
This sounds like a conversation that I've heard in the last 6 months to a year, that conversation is still going on. I want to stop you for a minute because you're saying so many things that are setting off flags in my head. One which is in the 80s, you were the first professional development person. Prior to that, it was volunteers, and it was the women's group, which says to me, probably affluent philanthropists, political donors. There is still the connotation, by and large, that the arts are for the elite.
Yes, exactly. And that was very much the case. As you were saying, the Women's Association primarily comprised of women who were married and their husbands were very prominent, either businessmen, bankers, attorneys. And so there was this core of well-to-do, well-connected, arts-loving women in the community. And they were the drive. They were the people that drove. And, as that translated over the years, their daughters went to work. They became career women themselves, versus, well, my husband does this, so I'm in charge of the philanthropy and volunteering.
Right. That was their job, right?
Yes.
Their job was to raise the children and then also help with the philanthropy, community involvement, etc. I'm going to cut to your book because this relates to me. I'm curious. So you wrote a book titled Black Diva of the 30s, The Life of Ruby Elzy. In the preface, you describe how a lunch conversation changed the course of your life and set you off on, quote, one of the greatest adventures of my life. That is what I describe the wow factor of the arts. So explain to me what set you off. What was it about that conversation that caused you to say this was one of the greatest adventures of your life?
Well, at that time, I was working at WOSU Public Media, and I was in fundraising, and we had just put on a repeater classical music station in Marion, Ohio. One of the volunteers who helped us was a woman named Madge Cooper Guthrie in her late 80s. She had her career in for more than 50 years in radio. She was known as the First Lady of Marion Radio. And we were sat together at a lunch in Marion, and she just said, well, how did you get in public broadcasting and things that, well, kind of went the circuitous way. And I said, well, actually, I said my training and background was I trained to be an opera singer. And she said, what did you do? And I mentioned, I'd been in the debut production of Opera Columbus, did a role in that, and that I'd done, these roles with Opera Columbus, Columbus Light Opera, which I had co-founded. And so I was just talking about what I had done. And she said, have you ever heard of a singer named Ruby Elsie? And I said, no, I haven't. And she said, well, she was the first Serena in Porgy and Bess. Well, of course, I had heard of Porgy and Bess, and I knew that Serena is the second most important role and actually sings probably the most demanding piece in the entire work, My Man's Gone Now. And Madge said, Ruby was a classmate of mine. I was in the OSU Women's Glee with her in 1929. And I was stunned because I thought, well, I went to Ohio State. I was in the opera program there. I had gone to the University of Cincinnati. I said, but particularly with Ohio State, I couldn't believe that there was someone who was involved in the original production of Porgy and Bess. I mean, the greatest, the most popular, the most enduring opera ever written by an American composer. And that someone from Ohio State had been in that production, and there was nothing about her at the School of Music. I would think, wow, this would be something you would want to celebrate. That time, that year, happened to be the Gershwin Centennial, the 100th anniversary of his birth, and a lot of recordings were coming out on CD for the first time, including the Gershwin Memorial Concert at the Hollywood Bowl, September 8th, 1937, 2 months after he died. I got that recording, and I heard Ruby Elsie sing My Man's Gone Now, live in concert at the Hollywood Bowl. And I was stunned. And I said, wow, I cannot believe the sound of this voice. And I've just got to find out more about her. And so I went to the library. I went to the Lawrence Lee Theater Research Institute at Ohio State, part of the OSU libraries. And I started piecing together things. I found her sister still alive in Mississippi. I found the family of the man who discovered her at this small black college in Mississippi and, overwhelmed by her voice, decided to bring her to Ohio State in 1927. It had just 2 years before started its first ever department of music. And after I had met these people, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. But then as I went along, I said, wow, there's a material here for a book with letters and correspondence. And it took 4 years to research, a year to write, and it was picked up by the first publisher I went to, University Press of Mississippi. She was originally Ruby Elsie from Mississippi. And so somebody said, you should talk to them because she's a native of Mississippi. So I did. And they picked up the book and published it in 2004. Just 2 weeks ago was the 20th anniversary of its publication. It was like that, as I said, was the greatest adventure of my life. Here, how did this 10-word question, have you ever heard of a singer named Ruby Elsie? Most people, if they were, oh, gee, that's interesting. Why did it seize me? Why did it grab me? And I think it was because, again, my own background in the arts, my love of opera and music and stuff. So, and that is the power of the arts, of the connection and everything, that grabs you and pulls you in.
Yeah, and that's what I have, the word connectivity come in my mind. And that's one thing that I say over and over, specifically when it comes to arts advocacy. that we have to know our audience and we have to find that connection with that audience. You can't go in and say to a lawmaker, well, you need to support the arts because they uplift.
Yes.
I say, no, a bra uplifts.
Yes.
The
yes.
arts are
yes.
The arts are foundational to any skill needed for all industries. So you and I previously talked about how in that public realm, the arts often take a backseat to all things else, all other,
yes.
Industries, etc. And especially in public officials understanding the impact or the importance of arts and culture when it comes to a city or state's identity.
Yes.
And so what you just described feeds into that, where here is this treasure. I've said for years, Ohio is the creative capital of the Midwest.
Yes.
There's Chicago, but it's not Illinois. And when I said that, it was a way to reframe how we think of arts and culture as a collective power for change.
Yes.
And Ohio's rich, deep history in the arts, given how many urban, dense areas, culturally rich institutions, but yet we still seem to have a difficult time shifting that narrative and changing mindsets. How do you respond to that?
Well, you and I talked about this over lunch, and I was saying, when a city, a state, whatever, is trying to entice a company to come locate there, and amongst the other things, okay, schools and everything, do you take them to your homeless shelters? No, you take them to your museums. You take them to the cultural institutions because you're trying to have people bring their families and everything here to settle. So what are you going to tell them? Hey, when you're here living here, what do you have? You have this fantastic museum. You have Thurber House, one of the great literary centers of the Midwest.
Right. And we also have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Cleveland Orchestra, arguably one of the top 3 orchestras in the world, the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is arguably in the top 5 museums in the country, the Toledo Museum of Art, the Cincinnati Symphony. Youngstown is the first theater. Warner Brothers are from Youngstown. We can go on and on and on. For me, though, during the pandemic specifically, when I hear from a legislative leader, well, why should we fund the arts? They're for rich white old people.
Yes.
And it was like, wait, what?
No.
So when I digested that and saying, why do we still have the connotation? It goes back to your opening comment about the Women's Association led the funding, volunteers for these institutions. And I thought, I remember why. Or realize why, because for 40 years, when we engage stakeholders, elected officials in the arts, what do? We bring them to the orchestra gala. We bring them to the opening of Hamilton, the Nutcracker, the fall exhibit. Yes. That is like Honda wanting a tax break, and they take the governor to the Honda dealership and say, look at the 2024 Civic, isn't it beautiful? But when Honda wants a tax break or incentive, they take the governor to the assembly plant floor and say it takes these many Ohioans to build one car. And that's where I think the shift has to be when we talk about the arts. It's not about the performance where transformation happens. It can certainly happen there, right? You go and you have that wow factor. But it's the process where the people that are involved day in and day out along the way, participating in programs or classes, etc., that's where the transformation happens. How many hundreds of people are employed in the sector that support manufacturing, sewers, lighting techs? So again, in your experience, what trajectory have you seen in shaping public opinion about arts importance?
Well, that's a good question, because one of the things, again, looking at my long career, going back to the 80s and stuff, you and I talked about the fact the 80s was such an entrepreneurial time. How many organizations, my organization, the Columbus Light Opera, got, and And in part, it was because there was a governor in Dick Celeste, and there was the OAC under Wayne Lawson. And there, boy, you had, the arts community had two great friends. And so over the years, as the impetus has come for, well, our first priority in the legislature is to cut taxes. It's had an impact and everything. I actually got more money as a first year organization from the Ohio Arts Council for Columbus Light Opera in 1986 than I did in my last year as director of the Ohio Library. But again, it's partly been to the fact that newspapers, other things, the media which told you about what was going on in the arts has changed a great deal and stuff, and so now it is much more upon us through our social media, through our websites, those are our communications tools, our events, etc., things of that nature. I'm trying to think, as you well know, Angela, and everything, how many newspapers even today have critics that cover the arts and are reporting on the arts, and newspaper readership, is down. So, or people read it as I do online now. I used to get my paper and my front doorstep and everything, but now I read the news online and stuff. So the challenge is, how do we take those new tools and convey the importance to them, particularly to our legislators. I made the point to you the day and everything. We were criticized a couple of years ago, the Ohio Library, as a waste of taxpayers' money. Well, the state's support of Ohio, the criticism was, if people think Ohio literature is important, then let them dig into their wallets and support it. And it happened that I was just getting ready to testify at the Ohio Senate. Randy Gardner, who was a great champion of the arts and libraries, said, I want you to testify first. And so I pointed out, what the state, through its budget, spends to support Ohio literature through the Ohio Library Association comes out to less than 3 cents per Ohioan. By comparison, we spend $154.93 per Ohioan on corrections.
Yes. So
maybe we spend a little more on libraries and literature now. We can spend less on prisons 10 years from now.
That's what I say. If we spent more on prevention, we'd spend less on correction. So let's talk a little bit about the preventative benefit of literary. Cite me a couple of statistics, because I kind of want to play a little back and forth with you here, to kind of give you an idea of where my head is thinking as we go forward in what I'm calling a renaissance of arts relevance. So cite me a little bit about the importance of literature, books, reading.
Well, obviously, 15 years ago, everyone said, when Kindle first came out, print is dead. It's going to go away. It is not. Young people, incredibly love to read, and they love that tactile feeling of a book. We started the Ohio Book Festival in 2007 with 10 authors and a couple of hundred attendees. When the last book festival was held in April, right before I retired, we had 5,800 attendees, and we had 125 authors. So the number of authors had grown, the number of audience had grown. The Book Loft, a German Village, which was our official bookseller, sold 2,711 books. The manager of the Book Loft said to me, David, I don't know if you figured that out, but we were selling an average of 7 books every minute for 6.5 hours at Columbus Metro Library. And of course, their own book festival in July was an even bigger success. So people love books. They love reading. The lives that are transformed. Yeah, and you're talking about young writers too. One of the examples I like to use for Ohioan is we give an annual prize called the Ohioan Walter Rumsey Marvin Grant. And it goes to an Ohio writer age 30 or younger who has not yet published a book. They can be a writer, a published writer, but they cannot have published a book. In the year 2000, the winner of that prize, one is given a year. It's $1,000 cash prize. The winner that year was Anthony Doerr at the age of 26. 15 years later, he won the Pulitzer Prize for All the Light We Cannot See, which has since been made into a miniseries. And so I asked him, I said, Tony, did that prize really help you? Because you're such a fantastic writer. And he said, well, I'm not saying I wouldn't. But he said, I can tell you, when you're a young writer trying to break out, and there's so much competition, to have someone credible like the Ohio Library Association give you that prize, it's as if someone who is legitimate in the world points a finger to you and says to everyone else, keep your eye on that writer, they're good. And he said, within a year of winning the Marvin Grant, I had a contract for my first book and an agent. So would those things have happened without perhaps, but it certainly helped. And so the thing is, you're impacting readers, you're impacting writers, musicians, winning, coming up, in the Arts Educator Awards at the Columbus Symphony and things of that nature. So, or the art classes at Columbus Museum of Art, the writing classes at Thurber House, who knows that perhaps that is going to be the spark that 20 years from now will lead to the next great career of a writer, a painter, or whatever.
Right. And as you were describing that, I thought about like the Heisman Award, right, that they give for football. It sounds similar to where, It's a spark. You don't know whether that individual will go to the NFL or not, or would they have done it anyway?
Yes.
But it is. There's some sort of validation. But for me, again, to go back to literacy, education, STEM, I feel that as STEM increased in momentum, we must get more technical skills, all of that. That's where the arts culture focus was on the decline. And now we've seen a shift in what employers are looking for when they're hiring young professionals. Now we're lacking communication skills. We're lacking strategic thinking or problem solving or collaborative skills. What do you say to a lawmaker when testifying for funding where it's critical to support something like the Ohioana or other literary programs because it builds what?
Well, obviously, a state wants to have a thinking population. It has to have, people who can reason, rationalize, do things. And nothing trains you better for that than the arts, that stimulation. I don't know if it's so much as what you are learning as it is, it provides you with the impetus of how to think, how to process information and things of that nature. And so that's why I think, the arts education for me, I always, who's the greatest American president? Abraham Lincoln. He grew up, only went to school 1 year, but he was an avid reader of Shakespeare and poetry and things of that nature. And how wonderfully reflected in his Gettysburg Address and other things. You can tell this was a man, that read, and so I think all of those things, exposure to the arts, and that's one of the things as a young person, I was such an admirer of President Kennedy, and the fact that he, and probably a lot of it through the influence of his wife, Jacqueline, the First Lady, but, made art such an important focus for the first time. It's like, well, why are the arts important? To have a well-rounded society, to have well-rounded individuals. You have to have something more than math and science and other things of that nature. I think the goal of society is you can't make people have a rich life, but to provide the opportunity to live a rich life. And yeah.
Did you employ any unique tactics during your advocacy work? You mentioned how the funding from the 1980s versus the year before you retired, that difference. What advice would you have? I know you recently retired. How do you get the attention of lawmakers who put arts in the backseat?
Yes. Well, we were very fortunate in the last few years of my time at Ohio. And I mean, Governor and Mrs. DeWine, huge supporters. I mean, obviously the Governor's Imagination Library, now today the Dolly Parton Imagination Library of Ohio, that Mrs. DeWine in particular was a great catalyst for. Arts funding went up. I have to say, in large part, that was thanks to you, Angela. I mean, you were the greatest champion, of arts funding, for a long time in the state of Ohio, and you need somebody to have that, the person who's going to be the point person and say this is why this is important, and has those meetings and talks to those legislators and everything. And of course, the other thing I always say that the legislators' assistants, because how much they actually
absolutely
your best friend is the legislative assistant.
Yes.
And sometimes that's what I've said about, I did make that point one time testifying to the legislature, and when they talked about, how many people you need, and I pointed out, Ohio, when it was a staff of only 4, and I said, we cannot function with less than 4 people. And I said, look at yourselves. I said, I have had such a great time working with all of your aides and assistants. How would you be able to serve your constituency if you did not have them?
Great point.
Bottom line, you have to have, you can't serve without people.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing is you're making it relatable. It goes back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation, which is find that connecting point that makes what you do relatable to whomever you're seeking to get investment and support from. And I also say, too, that advocacy lives in the district. It's not in the state house halls. You have to make it personal. You have to meet them where they are. I equate going to visit a legislator or congressperson in their office like visiting them when they're at a conference, because they're traveling to the state capitol or the Capitol Hill because they've got meetings, they've got deadlines, there's like work that they're doing, they've got committees and all of these things. And so typically you get a 15-minute appointment. By and large, it's with one of their aides to present your case. But imagine, I think I counted up with one legislator, they had 13 meetings by 11:30.
Mm-hmm.
And they're meeting with, regulatory, arts, nursing homes, audit, all these industries.
Yeah.
How do you stick in their mind? So meet them where they are in the district.
Yes.
With their constituents.
I have to say too, and you've probably seen this as well, how many times you have been to, okay, it's a budget hearing. There's a committee that you're in front of, and members come in and out. And so sometimes you're okay, I want that person here, and they get up there. I've got another meeting I need to go to and stuff. So, and it's like, well, how do you do? And again, thank goodness that their assistants or aides, bring them up to snuff, hopefully, on what is happening.
Well, and if you're like me, David, there are times, depending on when I'm up to testify, if I know there's a key member that I want to hear my message and they get up to leave, I might get up and follow them out and
Yes.
stop them in the hallway and just say,
Yes.
hey, can we connect offline about, why I'm here? So, and testifying is important, but really I consider that the show.
Yes.
And it really is all of the legwork behind the scenes with their aides, with staff, and it has to be consistent. It can't just be a one and done.
Yeah, no. I do one thing I did find was helpful when I was testifying, and that is I would find out each legislator that was on that committee, either a literary site or an author that was from their district. And I would point, your author was just, honored with the Ohioan Award last year, or they were just at the Ohioan Book Festival, earlier this month, and they did 2 outreach programs to schools. And so things of that nature to try to say, okay, so live, like you said, you've got to kind of personalize it. The one thing I was told long ago, and you probably were, to send mass emails or e-blasts and everything, letters is not effective, and one senator told me, I will tell you, one phone call, one letter from somebody who lives in my district will get my attention.
I say we can't solve advocacy challenges today with advocacy practices of the past.
Yeah. No.
And all it takes is one.
Yes.
And it has to be authentic. And another thing is we must reframe art's impact to resonate.
Yes.
It can't be the check the box and we're done. You covered that, and that's such a valuable point. And I love you connecting what you're doing with each legislator and their district. They all want to be winners or champions, right? They all want to. So let's help them be a champion. Yes.
Please do utilize the members of your board. I mean, that's one of the most important functions that, especially for something like, not everybody is, Ohioana Library is a statewide organization, and there are some arts organizations where obviously they're focused on a specific city and everything. So their board members all come from that area. But if you do represent a statewide constituency and everything, that's one of the best ways that you can use them, and they can really be of help to you.
That's so key. Relationships and that building advocates to advocate on behalf of your organization is so important.
Yes.
I appreciate your time. I see that, I could talk to you forever, and I've told you that before. I will include in the show notes where people can find your book, a little bit about yourself and all of that. But before we end, I have 2 questions that I like to ask every guest. One is, how do you define the arts?
I define the arts as any creative endeavor that enriches you either through practicing it or experiencing it. So you can either be a person who is actually doing the art or witnessing the art, etc., things of that nature. But either way, it's really an interactive thing between, the artist and the audience and stuff. I think that's the best connection.
Super. And lastly, what color do you love most and why?
I love blue. I'm not wearing it, but blue is my favorite color. I don't know why. I've just always loved it. So, I don't know. I've never thought about why it's my favorite color. Maybe because my eyes are blue. I don't know. I want to ask you a question,
Okay.
And everything. So as we are in the early stages of another state budget and everything, how do you think things are looking for the arts this year?
Well, I tend to have the mindset that I go full force as if it's going to be, down to the last minute, down to the wire, because you never really know. And
No.
so what I would do now is start prepping and having a little bit of those feeler meetings to see where everybody's heads are. The biggest obstacle right now in knowing is because of an election year.
Yeah.
And so we typically have, as you well know, there's a lot of
Yes.
distraction going on, and we won't have a chance to have the legislature back until after the election. So I think we're okay right now.
Yeah.
It's where my head is. I think we're okay, but it doesn't mean that we can't let up.
I always did say to somebody, they said, "What are you going to do when you retire?" Now that I'm retired, I said, "Well, actually, I think I may run. I may run for the legislature, and I will run as a champion of the arts and libraries, because I don't think there ever has been one whose platform was, 'We need the arts.'"
I appreciate you saying that, because one of my personal missions is that when we have debates, one of the debate questions is, do you support arts and culture? Would you ever imagine that, right? And so that's just the little, in my mind,
yes,
I laugh to myself, but think that should be at the forefront of any conversation, because to make this a full circle moment, if we spent more in arts and culture, which is a preventative, we would spend less correcting so many issues that challenge our society.
Yes. 100%. I agree that is it and stuff. And again, why is it so darn hard to make that argument? To me, that should just be, but maybe it's just our mindset, Angela, and everything. We see it, it's like, why doesn't everybody see it like this?
Well, we go back to the title of this podcast, Arts Redefined. It's my mission to redefine what we think of when we hear the word arts. Arts, I don't know when it became a 4-letter word.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm determined to change that and shift that. So arts are at the table when we are considering any type of problem solving, prosperity, economic development driver.
Excellent. Well,
Wonderful.
Angela,
David,
thank
you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. And I hope we will stay in touch. And I've enjoyed the podcast so far, and we'll look forward to seeing more.
Absolutely. Thank you.